The doctor's words were quiet, clinical, and absolutely final. Scarring, impossible, broken. Saskia Vale didn't just lose a dream that day, she lost her future. While her sister celebrated a new pregnancy, Saskia felt herself shrinking, becoming a ghost in a world bursting with life. So she ran, to a place where winter never ended. To Obsidian Hall, the master of the house. Varric Zane was cold, ancient, dangerous. He warned her to stay away from the shadows, but the shadows were whispering to her, 7 of them, 7 lost souls trapped between life and death. Varric thought he had hired a caretaker. He thought she was weak because she had nothing left to live for. He was wrong. He didn't know that a woman with an empty heart has the most room to love. Saskia wasn't just going to care for his shadow children. To save them, she would have to bleed for them, and she would defy the devil himself to finally become a mother. The clinic smelled of bleach and broken hope. Saskia sat in the waiting room, her spine pressed against the vinyl chair, watching the clock's second hand stutter forward. Each tick felt like a small death. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everyone in the same sickly pallor, the desperate, the hopeful, the ones who still believed their bodies would cooperate. She didn't believe anymore. Her phone buzzed. Maris again. The 3rd call this morning. Saskia silenced it without looking, her thumb moving with practiced efficiency. Whatever her sister wanted could wait. Everything could wait. Time had become meaningless when measured against the emptiness that had taken root inside her. Saskia Vale. The nurse's voice cut through the antiseptic air. Saskia stood, her legs mechanical, and followed the woman down a corridor lined with inspirational posters. Asterisk miracles happen every day. The words made her stomach turn. Doctor. Chen's office was smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply grown hollower, taking up less space in the world. The doctor sat behind her desk, hands folded, her expression carefully neutral, the look medical professionals perfected when delivering bad news to women who had heard it too many times before. Your latest results came back. Dr. Chen slid a folder across the desk. Saskia didn't reach for it. She already knew. She could feel the knowledge in her bones, cold and certain as winter. There's significant scarring. The endometriosis has progressed, despite treatment. I'm afraid. I understand. Saskia's voice came out flat, emotionless. She had practiced this response, rehearsed it in the mirror, until her face showed nothing. Thank you for your time. She left before the doctor could offer platitudes or pamphlets for support groups, where women sat in circles and pretended grief could be shared like recipes. Outside, the November wind bit through her coat. Saskia walked without direction, her feet carrying her through streets she barely saw. The city moved around her, couples pushing strollers, pregnant women laughing into their phones, children shrieking in playgrounds. The world was full of fertility, mocking and abundant. Her phone buzzed again. This time she answered. Finally, Maris's voice burst through, bright and breathless. I've been trying to reach you all morning. Saskia, I have news, amazing news. You have to come over right now. I can't tell you over the phone. I just can't. I'm busy. Please. It's important. Life-changing important. Something in her sister's tone made Saskia's chest tighten. She knew that particular quality of joy, had heard it in waiting rooms and baby showers, had learned to recognize it from 50 paces so she could turn and walk the other way. But Maris was her sister, her only family since their mother died. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Maris's apartment smelled like vanilla candles and fresh paint. She opened the door already crying, mascara tracking down her cheeks, and pulled Saskia into a hug that felt like drowning. I'm pregnant. The words tumbled out between sobs. 12 weeks. We didn't want to say anything until we were sure, but Saskia, it's real. I'm going to be a mother. Saskia stood in the embrace, her arms at her sides, feeling nothing. The numbness spread from her core outward, a frost that protected her from the sharp edges of her sister's happiness. She should say something. Congratulations. I'm happy for you. The words existed somewhere in her vocabulary, but her mouth wouldn't form them. Say something. Maris pulled back, searching Saskia's face. Please. Congratulations. The word landed between them like a stone. Maris's smile faltered, confusion flickering across her features. She reached for Saskia's hand, but Saskia stepped back, creating distance. I should go. I have work. Saskia, wait. But she was already moving toward the door, her body operating on autopilot, carrying her away from her sister's joy before it could cut any deeper. The bar was nearly empty at 3 in the afternoon. Saskia ordered whiskey and didn't taste it. The television above the counter played some daytime show with the sound off, people gesturing animatedly about nothing that mattered. Her phone sat on the bar, dark and silent. Maris hadn't called back. Good. Saskia didn't know what she would say if she did. I'm sorry, your happiness reminds me. I'm broken. I'm sorry I can't pretend anymore. I'm sorry I'm not the sister you deserve. Rough day. The bartender was young, probably 25, with kind eyes that hadn't yet learned cynicism. Saskia didn't answer. She pushed her empty glass forward for a refill. I shouldn't say this. The bartender continued, wiping down the counter, but you look like someone who needs a change. My cousin just posted a job listing. Live-in position. Good pay, room and board included. Some old estate outside the city, needs a caretaker. Might be nice to get away for a while. Saskia looked up. What kind of estate? Historical place. Obsidian Hall, I think it's called. Big old mansion, been in the same family for generations. The owner's looking for someone to manage the property, deal with maintenance, that sort of thing. My cousin said it's isolated, quiet, perfect for someone who wants to disappear for a bit. Disappear. The word resonated in Saskia's hollow chest. What did she have to stay for? A studio apartment filled with furniture she didn't care about. A job that paid bills but meant nothing. A sister whose growing belly would be a constant reminder of everything Saskia would never have. Give me the number. The bartender scribbled on a napkin, sliding it across the bar. Saskia stared at the digits, feeling something shift inside her, not hope, nothing so naive, but perhaps the faint possibility of escape. She called from the parking lot. A man answered on the first ring, his voice smooth and oddly formal, like he was reading from a script written centuries ago. Obsidian Hall. You're inquiring about the position. Yes. Can you start immediately? The question should have raised red flags. No interview, no references, no background check, but Saskia found she didn't care. Yes. Excellent. I'll send a car for you tomorrow morning. Bring only what you need. Everything else will be provided. The car arrived at dawn, black and sleek, the driver silent behind tinted windows. Saskia climbed in with a single suitcase, watching her apartment building disappear in the rearview mirror without sentiment. They drove for hours, the city giving way to suburbs, then farmland, then forest. The trees grew denser, their branches forming a canopy that blocked the weak November sun. Finally, the car turned onto a private road, gravel crunching beneath the tires. Obsidian Hall rose from the landscape like a wound. Black stone, sharp angles, windows that reflected nothing. It looked less like a home and more like a monument to something best forgotten. The driver opened her door. Saskia stepped out, her breath clouding in the sudden cold. The temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees since leaving the main road, as if the estate generated its own climate of perpetual winter. The front doors opened before she could knock. He stood in the threshold, tall and impossibly still, dressed in black that made his pale skin luminous. His eyes found hers, and Saskia felt the impact like a physical thing, a pressure behind her sternum, a tightening in her throat. "Miss Vale." His voice matched the one from the phone, cultured and ancient. "Welcome to Obsidian Hall. I am Varric Zane." He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. Saskia crossed the threshold, her footsteps echoing on marble floors. The interior was vast and cold, lit by chandeliers that cast more shadow than light. Behind her she heard the doors close. Not swing shut, but close with deliberate finality. The sound of heavy locks sliding into place followed, metal against metal, sealing her inside. Saskia turned. Varric stood with his back to the doors, his expression unreadable, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth that held no warmth whatsoever. "I'm so pleased you've come," he said softly. "We've been waiting for you." The cold pressed against Saskia's skin like a living thing, seeping through her coat, her sweater, finding the spaces between her ribs. She stood in the center of the vast entrance hall, marble stretching in all directions, and felt the weight of Varric's gaze settle on her shoulders like frost. "We?" The word came out steadier than she felt. "You said we've been waiting." Varric's smile deepened, though it never reached his eyes. Those eyes, pale grey, almost colorless, tracked her movements with the patience of something that had learned to wait centuries for what it wanted. "The house has been empty too long, Miss Vale, empty of the right kind of presence." He moved past her, his footsteps silent despite the hard floor, and gestured toward a corridor that stretched into shadow. "Come, I'll show you to your quarters. You'll want to settle in before dinner." Saskia's fingers tightened around the handle of her suitcase. The leather was warm from her grip, a small anchor of reality in this place that felt increasingly unreal. She followed because there was nothing else to do, because the doors behind her were locked, because she had signed a contract that bound her here for 6 months. The corridor swallowed them. Chandeliers hung at intervals, their light dim and amber, casting more darkness than illumination. Portraits lined the walls, faces from another era, all pale skin and dark clothing, all with the same unsettling quality of eyes that seemed to track movement. Saskia felt them watching as she passed. "The children," she said, her voice echoing slightly. "The 7 wards. Where are they?" "Nearby." Varric didn't turn, didn't slow his pace. "They're shy, unaccustomed to strangers. You'll meet them when they're ready." Something moved in her peripheral vision. Saskia turned her head sharply, but there was only shadow pooling in a doorway, thick and somehow wrong. It didn't behave like normal shadow. It seemed to pulse, to breathe. She blinked, and it was just darkness again, ordinary and still. "The estate is old," Varric said, as if he'd sensed her reaction. "It has its moods. You'll grow accustomed to them." They climbed a staircase, wide and curving, the banister smooth beneath Saskia's free hand. The wood was cold, colder than wood should be. Her breath continued to fog in the air, small clouds that dissipated slowly, reluctantly. At the top of the stairs, Varric led her down another corridor, this one narrower, more intimate, doors lined both sides. All closed, all identical. He stopped before one near the end, and produced a key from his pocket, an actual iron key, heavy and ornate, the kind that belonged in a museum. "Your room," he said, unlocking the door and pushing it open. The space beyond was larger than Saskia had expected. A 4-poster bed dominated one wall, draped in dark velvet. A fireplace stood cold and empty. its mantel carved with symbols that hurt to look at too directly. Tall windows overlooked grounds that stretched into mist, and a writing desk sat beneath them, its surface bare except for a single oil lamp. "Dinner is at 8, Varick said from the doorway. He hadn't entered, she noticed. He stood on the threshold, his body angled as if waiting for permission. "I'll send someone to collect you." "One of the children?" His expression shifted, something flickering behind those pale eyes. Amusement, perhaps. Or hunger. "Perhaps. Rest, Miss Vale. You've had a long journey." He closed the door before she could respond. Saskia heard his footsteps retreat down the corridor, fading into silence that felt too complete, too absolute. She set her suitcase on the floor and moved to the windows. The grounds below were vast, manicured, despite the wildness at their edges. Gardens stretched in geometric patterns, their plants winter bare and skeletal. Beyond them, forest pressed close, dark trees that seemed to lean toward the house with deliberate intent. The temperature in the room was barely warmer than the corridor. Saskia's breath still fogged. She turned to the fireplace, searching for wood, for kindling, for anything to burn. The grate was empty, spotless, as if fire had never touched it. A sound made her freeze, soft, barely audible, like fabric brushing against stone. Saskia turned slowly. The room was empty, the door still closed, but the shadows in the corners seemed deeper than they should be, pooling with that same wrong quality she'd noticed in the corridor. She watched them, her pulse quickening, and one of the shadows moved. Not the way shadows move when light shifts. This was independent, deliberate. It detached from the corner near the wardrobe and flowed across the wall like liquid darkness, stopping just beyond the reach of the window's grey light. "Hello?" Saskia's voice came out barely above a whisper. The shadow trembled, and then, impossibly, it reached toward her, a tendril of darkness extending across the wallpaper, thin as a child's arm. Saskia should have been terrified. Every rational part of her mind screamed that this was wrong, impossible, dangerous. But beneath the fear something else stirred. Recognition, perhaps, or kinship. She thought of her sister Maris, of the shadows that had taken her, and wondered if they had looked like this. She took a step closer. The shadow recoiled, pulling back toward the corner, but not fleeing entirely. It hovered there, watchful, waiting. "It's all right," Saskia said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you." A sound came from the shadow then, a whisper barely formed, that might have been words or might have been wind through cracks in old walls. Saskia strained to hear, leaning forward, and caught fragments. "Careful, he watches, always watches." Who watches? But she knew. The shadow shuddered violently and retreated fully into the corner, disappearing so completely that Saskia questioned whether it had been there at all. The room felt emptier for its absence, colder, more hostile. She wrapped her arms around herself and moved to the bed, sitting on its edge. The mattress was firm, the velvet coverlet soft beneath her fingers. She should unpack, she thought. Should prepare for dinner, should do something normal, something ordinary, to anchor herself in reality. Instead she sat and watched the corners of the room, waiting to see if the shadows would move again. Time passed strangely in Obsidian Hall. Saskia had no sense of how long she sat there before a knock sounded at her door, sharp, precise, 3 measured strikes. "Miss Vale," a woman's voice, low and careful. "Mr. Zane requests your presence for dinner." Saskia stood, smoothing her clothes. She hadn't changed, hadn't unpacked. She moved to the door and opened it to find a woman in her 60s, dressed in black, her silver hair pulled back severely from a face that might have been beautiful once, but was now all sharp angles and watchful eyes. "I'm Mrs. Crane," the woman said. "The housekeeper. Please, follow me." They descended the stairs in silence. Mrs. Crane moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to make herself invisible, her footsteps barely audible on the marble. Saskia tried to match her pace, but her own steps echoed, announcing her presence to the empty halls. The dining room was on the ground floor, through a series of corridors that twisted in ways that made Saskia lose her sense of direction. The house seemed larger on the inside than it had appeared from outside, its architecture impossible, its proportions wrong. Varick stood when she entered, a gesture of old-world courtesy that felt like mockery. He'd changed clothes, still black, but now formal, a suit that fit him with tailored precision. The dining table stretched between them, long enough to seat 20, set for two at opposite ends. "Miss Vale," he said, gesturing to the far chair. "Please sit." The distance between them felt deliberate. A statement. Saskia moved to her seat, aware of his eyes tracking her, aware of the way the candlelight caught in his pale hair and made his skin seem luminous, inhuman. Crane served the first course. Soup, rich and dark, its scent earthy and strange. Saskia picked up her spoon, watching Varick do the same. He ate with precise, measured movements, never hurrying, never pausing. "You've settled in?" he asked after a moment. "The room is adequate." He smiled. "How diplomatic. You're wondering about the cold." It wasn't a question. Saskia set down her spoon. "Among other things, the heating system is old, temperamental. I've grown accustomed to it." He tilted his head, studying her. "You strike me as someone who adapts well to difficult circumstances, Miss Vale. Your application suggested as much. 3 years caring for your ailing mother. 2 years before that working in hospice care. You're familiar with suffering." The words hung in the air like smoke. Saskia felt her jaw tighten. "I'm familiar with helping people through difficult times." "Is there a difference?" Varick's voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was something underneath it, a current of cruelty, of pleasure taken in discomfort. Suffering is suffering, whether we frame it as care or not. We're all just waiting for the end, aren't we? Some of us simply take longer to arrive there. Saskia forced herself to meet his gaze. "The children, the wards. When will I meet them?" Impatient. He leaned back in his chair, the candlelight casting his face in sharp relief. "They're here, Miss Vale. They're always here. They simply choose not to be seen." As if in response to his words, the candles flickered. All of them, simultaneously, their flames bending toward the center of the table before straightening again. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, and Saskia felt that same sensation from her bedroom, the sense of being watched by something that existed just beyond the edge of perception. "There," Varick said softly, his eyes never leaving Saskia's face. "Do you feel them now?" She did. The air had changed, grown heavier, more present. Saskia's skin prickled with awareness, every nerve alert. The shadows weren't empty anymore. They were occupied, inhabited by presences that pressed against the boundaries of visibility. "Why can't I see them?" she asked. "Because they don't want to be seen. Not yet. Not by you." Varick stood, moving around the table with that same silent grace. He stopped beside her chair, close enough that she could feel the cold radiating from him like winter given form. "They've been hurt, Miss Vale, betrayed. They've learned to hide, to protect themselves. You'll need to earn their trust." He reached out, and Saskia forced herself not to flinch as his fingers brushed her shoulder, cold, so cold it burned. "And mine," he added, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You'll need to earn mine as well." Saskia turned her head to look up at him. This close, she could see that his eyes weren't grey at all. They were colorless, like ice, like nothing. "I'm here to care for the children, not to earn anyone's approval." Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or respect. He withdrew his hand and stepped back. "We'll see," he said. "6 months is a long time, Miss Vale. Long enough for many things to change." He returned to his seat, and dinner continued in tense silence. Crane brought more courses. Meat that Saskia couldn't identify, vegetables that tasted of earth and ash, wine so dark it looked black in the candlelight. Saskia ate mechanically, aware of Verrick's eyes on her, aware of the shadows pressing closer with each passing moment. When the meal finally ended, Verrick stood. "Mrs. Crane will show you back to your room. Tomorrow your duties begin in earnest. Sleep well, Miss Vale, if you can." The last words felt like a threat. Mrs. Crane led her back through the twisting corridors, up the stairs to her door. The housekeeper paused before leaving, her hand on Saskia's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Lock your door," she said quietly, "and don't open it until morning, no matter what you hear." Then she was gone, disappearing down the corridor with that same silent efficiency, leaving Saskia alone in the hallway's amber gloom. Saskia entered her room and turned the key in the lock, hearing the mechanism click into place. The sound should have been reassuring. Instead, it felt like sealing herself in a tomb. The shadows in the corners were waiting. She could feel them now, their presence undeniable. 7 of them, she thought. 7 distinct presences, each one different, each one watching with desperate, hungry attention. "I see you," Saskia whispered to the darkness. "I don't know how yet, but I see you." The shadows trembled. And then, slowly, carefully, they began to move, not toward her but around her, circling like cautious animals, approaching something that might be either threat or salvation. Saskia stood still, letting them come, letting them investigate. One shadow, smaller than the others, more timid, reached out again, that same tendril of darkness extending toward her hand. Saskia held her breath and extended her fingers. The shadow touched her skin. Cold flooded through her, so intense it burned. But beneath the cold, something else, warmth, desperate and fading, like embers barely clinging to life. And with it came emotion, raw and overwhelming, fear, loneliness, hope, hunger, not for food, but for recognition, for acknowledgement, for someone to finally see them as more than darkness. Saskia gasped, tears springing to her eyes. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm here, and I see you." The shadow wrapped around her wrist like a bracelet, gentle, grateful. The others drew closer, emboldened, and Saskia felt them brush against her, her arms, her shoulders, her hair, each touch bringing another flood of sensation, another wave of desperate emotion. They were children. Whatever else they were, whatever Verrick had done to them, they were children, and they were suffering. "I'll help you," Saskia said, her voice breaking. "I don't know how yet, but I will. I promise." The shadows clung to her, and for the first time since entering Obsidian Hall, Saskia felt warm. The days that followed fell into a strange rhythm. Mornings, Saskia woke to find the shadows gone, retreated to wherever they hid during daylight hours. She would dress, descend to a breakfast she ate alone in a small parlor, and then wander the halls of Obsidian Hall, trying to understand its impossible geography. The house resisted understanding. Corridors that should have led to the same destination opened onto different rooms each time. Staircases appeared where none had been before. Doors locked themselves or opened of their own accord, and everywhere, always, she felt Verrick's presence, not physically, but as a weight, a pressure, a constant awareness that she was being observed. She saw him at dinner each evening, those long, tense meals where they sat at opposite ends of the table and spoke in careful circles around the truth. He asked about her day, her comfort, her adjustment to the house. She asked about the children, their needs, their histories. He never answered directly, always deflecting, always watching her with those colorless eyes that seemed to see straight through flesh to whatever lay beneath. But the nights belonged to the shadows. They came to her room as soon as darkness fell, flowing under the door, through the cracks in the walls, materializing from the corners where light couldn't reach. 7 of them, distinct now that Saskia had learned to sense their individual presences. She gave them names in her mind. Whisper, the smallest and most timid. Echo, who seemed to carry fragments of voices. Frost, whose touch was coldest. Ember, who still held that fading warmth. Thorn, all sharp edges and defensive anger. Silk, smooth and gentle. And Void, the largest, who watched from the deepest shadows and rarely approached. They couldn't speak, not in words, but they communicated through touch, through emotion, through the images they pressed into her mind when she let them close enough. Saskia saw fragments of their past, a room with 7 beds, a woman singing lullabies, warmth and safety that had been torn away. She saw Varric, younger but no less cold, his hands reaching out, his voice promising protection that had become prison. "He keeps you here," Saskia whispered one night, whisper curled around her wrist, echo brushing against her shoulder. "He's done something to you, bound you to this place." The shadows shuddered in affirmation. Thorn pressed against her, and Saskia felt rage, hot and impotent, the fury of something trapped and helpless. "I'll find a way," she promised. "There has to be a way to free you." But as the days passed, Saskia began to understand the depth of her own trap. The contract she'd signed wasn't just employment, it was binding in ways that went beyond legal obligation. She felt it when she approached the front doors, a pressure in her chest that made breathing difficult. She felt it when she thought about leaving, a tightening around her throat like invisible hands. Varric had caught her trying the doors on her 4th day. He'd appeared behind her without sound, his voice soft and amused. "Going somewhere, Miss Vale?" "I wanted some air. The grounds are extensive. Feel free to walk them." But the gates, he'd moved past her, placing one pale hand on the door. The gates remained closed. For everyone's protection. Whose protection? Saskia had demanded. Mine or yours? He'd smiled then, that cold, empty expression that held no humor. "Does it matter? We're all trapped by something, Miss Vale. Geography is the least of it." Now, 2 weeks into her stay, Saskia stood in the library, a vast room she'd discovered on the 2nd floor, its shelves stretching to a ceiling lost in shadow. She'd been searching for answers, for some record of the house's history, of Varric's past, of what had happened to the 7 children who now existed as shadows. The books were old, their pages brittle, written in languages she couldn't read. But she'd found one volume, smaller than the rest, its cover unmarked. Inside, handwritten entries in English, dated over a century ago. "The Master requires 7, 1 entry read, 7 pure souls, 7 innocent hearts. The binding must be complete before the winter solstice, or all will be lost." Saskia's hands trembled as she turned the pages. More entries, more details about a ritual, about children gathered from nearby villages, about promises made and broken. And then, near the end, a final entry in different handwriting, shakier, desperate. "God forgive me. They're not dead, but they're not alive. He's trapped them between, feeding on their fear, their despair. I tried to stop him, but I was too late. They're shadows now, and he keeps them like pets, like possessions. Someone must free them. Someone must." The entry ended abruptly, the ink smeared as if the writer had been interrupted. Interesting reading. Saskia spun around. Varric stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. How long had he been there? How much had he seen? This house has a dark history, she said, keeping her voice steady. All old houses do. He moved into the room, his steps silent on the thick carpet. You're looking for answers, Miss Vale. I understand, but some questions are better left unasked. What did you do to them? The words came out before she could stop them. The children. What did you do? Varric's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air, a drop in temperature, a thickening of shadows. I saved them, he said softly. From death, from decay, from the inevitable rot that claims all flesh. They're preserved, Miss Vale. Perfect. Eternal. They're prisoners. They're protected. He was closer now, close enough that Saskia could see the absolute absence of warmth in his eyes. From a world that would have destroyed them, from time itself, I gave them immortality. You gave them hell. The words hung between them, sharp and final. Varric's smile faded, and for the first time, Saskia saw something genuine in his expression. Anger, cold, and vast as winter itself. You understand nothing, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow filled the entire room. You've been here mere weeks, playing at compassion, at understanding, but you don't know what it costs to preserve something precious, what sacrifices must be made. Then tell me. Saskia forced herself to hold his gaze. Explain it to me. Why should I? Varric tilted his head, studying her. You've already decided I'm the monster in this story. Nothing I say will change that. Try me. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then slowly, he reached out and took the book from her hands. His fingers brushed hers. Ice against ice now. Saskia's hands as cold as his from weeks in this frozen house. They were dying, he said finally. All 7 of them. Plague, Miss Vale. The kind that leaves nothing but corpses and grief. I offered them a choice, death or transformation. They chose life. They chose me. They were children. They couldn't consent to this. And yet here they are, alive, in their way, conscious, aware, more than they would have been as rotting corpses in the ground. He set the book aside and moved to the window, looking out at the grounds. You think I'm cruel, perhaps I am, but I'm also the only thing standing between them and true oblivion. Saskia felt the shadows stirring in the corners of the room. They'd followed her here, as they always did now. She could feel their agitation, their fear, their desperate need for her to understand the truth. What do you want from me? She asked. Why hire a caretaker if they don't need care? Varric turned back to her, and his smile returned, cold, knowing, terrible. Because they're fading, Miss Vale. Despite everything I've done, despite the binding, despite the sacrifices, they're fading, losing themselves to the darkness. And I thought perhaps, he paused, his eyes searching her face. Perhaps someone like you, someone who understands loss, who carries her own shadows, perhaps you could anchor them, give them something to hold on to, or give you something to feed on. The words came from instinct, from the pattern she'd been piecing together. Varric's presence at every meal, his questions about her day, her feelings, her adjustment. The way the house felt colder after their conversations, as if something had been drained from the air. His smile widened. Clever girl. Yes, there's that too. Despair is such a potent fuel, and you brought so much of it with you. Your sister, your mother, your carefully constructed walls of grief. I could taste it the moment you walked through my door. Saskia's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. I won't let you. You don't have a choice. The contract binds me here, I know, but it doesn't bind my will. It doesn't make me your victim. Varric's expression shifted, something like respect flickering behind the cruelty. "No," he said softly. "It doesn't, which makes you far more interesting than I anticipated." He moved toward the door, then paused. "A word of advice, Miss Vale. The shadows you've befriended, they're dangerous, not because they want to be, but because they're hungry, starving, and eventually hunger overcomes even the strongest bonds of affection. Be careful how close you let them come." Then he was gone, leaving Saskia alone in the library, with the shadows pressing close, their presence a cold comfort against the greater cold of Varric's words. That night, Saskia didn't return to her room. She stayed in the library, pulling books from shelves, searching for something, anything that might tell her how to break whatever binding held the children. The shadows stayed with her, their presence constant, their touches growing bolder as the hours passed. She found fragments, references to blood rituals, to pacts made with things that existed in the spaces between life and death. References to a key, a physical object that served as the anchor for the binding, but nothing concrete, nothing that told her where such a key might be or how to use it. Dawn was breaking when she finally admitted defeat. Grey light filtered through the windows, and the shadows began to retreat, pulling away from her with what felt like reluctance. "Don't go," Saskia whispered. "Not yet," but they had no choice. As sunlight touched the room, they dissolved, fading into the corners, into the cracks, into wherever they hid during the day. All except Void, the largest, who lingered a moment longer. Saskia felt its presence like a weight, like a warning, and then it too was gone. She stood, her body stiff from hours of sitting, and made her way back to her room. She needed to sleep, to think, to plan, but as she reached her door, she found it already open. Varric stood inside, beside her bed, holding something in his hands, a small wooden box, ornate and old, its surface carved with the same symbols that decorated the fireplace mantel. "Looking for this?" he asked softly. Saskia's breath caught. "The key, it had to be. Give it to me." "Why would I do that?" Varric set the box on her desk, his movements deliberate, taunting. "This is what keeps them bound, Miss Vale. What keeps them from dissipating entirely. Destroy it, and you don't free them. You kill them. Truly, finally, permanently." "You're lying." "Am I?" He moved toward her, and Saskia forced herself not to retreat. "You've grown attached to them. I can see it, feel it. You think you're their savior, but you're just another person who will fail them, just like everyone else." "I won't. You will." He was close now, close enough that she could see her reflection in his colorless eyes, small, fragile, human. "Because you can't save anyone, Miss Vale. Not your sister, not your mother, not these children. You're not strong enough. You never were." The words hit like physical blows, finding every doubt, every fear she'd carried for years. Saskia felt tears sting her eyes, felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack, and then she felt something else. A presence, cold and familiar, wrapping around her wrist, whisper, emerging despite the daylight, despite the danger, pressing against her skin with desperate urgency. The touch brought clarity, strength. The reminder that she wasn't alone. Saskia met Varric's gaze and saw surprise flicker there. "You're wrong," she said quietly. "I am strong enough, and I will save them." She pushed past him, grabbed the box from her desk, and ran. Behind her, she heard Varric's laugh, cold, delighted, dangerous. "Run then, Miss Vale. But there's nowhere in this house. I cannot find you. And when I do," his voice followed her down the corridor, echoing off the walls. "When I do, we'll see just how strong you really are." Saskia ran through the twisting corridors. The box clutched to her chest. Whisper's presence a cold comfort against her skin. The other shadows emerged from walls, from corners, from impossible spaces, flowing alongside her like a tide of darkness. She didn't know where she was going, didn't know what she would do when Varric caught her, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would not let him win, not without a fight. The corridor ahead ended in a door she'd never seen before, heavy oak bound with iron, locked, but as Saskia approached, the shadows surged forward, flowing into the lock, and she heard the mechanism click open. She pushed through and found herself in a room that shouldn't exist, circular, windowless, its walls covered in symbols that glowed with faint, sickly light. In the center stood a pedestal, empty, clearly meant to hold the box she carried. The binding room. The heart of Varric's power. Saskia heard footsteps behind her, measured and unhurried. Varric appeared in the doorway, his expression calm, almost pleased. "You found it," he said. "I'm impressed. Most people never make it this far. Let them go." Saskia held the box out, her hands steady despite her racing heart. "Let them go, or I destroy this, and kill them in the process. We've established that. Maybe. Or maybe you're lying. Maybe this is what's keeping them trapped, and destroying it will set them free." Varric's smile faded. "You're willing to take that risk, to gamble with their existence?" Saskia looked at the shadows gathered around her, all 7 now, pressing close, their presence a chorus of cold touches and desperate emotion. She felt their fear, their hope, their absolute trust in her judgment. "Yes," she said, "because anything is better than this, even death." For a long moment Varric said nothing. Then he stepped into the room and the door slammed shut behind him, sealing them all inside. "Very well, Miss Vale," he said softly, his eyes blazing with cold fire. "Let's see what you're truly made of." The air in the binding room thickened, pressing against Saskia's skin like water. The symbols on the walls pulsed faster, their sickly light casting Varric's face in alternating shadow and illumination. She could feel the box in her hands growing warmer, almost alive, responding to the proximity of the pedestal. "Put it down," Varric said, his voice carrying that same hypnotic quality that had drawn her into his world weeks ago. "You don't understand what you're holding." Saskia's fingers tightened around the carved wood. The shadows pressed closer, their cold touches sliding along her arms, her shoulders, her neck. She could feel their terror, their desperate hope that she would make the right choice. But which choice was right? Destroy the box and risk annihilating them? Place it on the pedestal and surrender whatever power it held to Varric? "Then explain it to me," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Tell me the truth. All of it." Varric moved closer, each step deliberate. The door behind him remained sealed, the symbols around its frame glowing brighter than the rest. "The box doesn't contain them. It contains me. Or rather, it contains what remains of my humanity, the last fragment of the man I was before I became this." He gestured to himself, that elegant, terrible form. "The children aren't trapped by the box. They're trapped by their connection to me, by the blood I gave them when I turned them." The words hit Saskia like physical blows. "You turned them, children." I was desperate. Dying. The transformation was incomplete, and I needed anchors to this world, souls bound to me by blood and magic. They were orphans, unwanted. I gave them immortality. His expression remained calm, but something flickered in his eyes. "I gave them purpose. You gave them prison." Saskia's hands shook now, rage burning through her fear. "You made them into shadows, trapped them in this house, used them. I saved them from worse fates." Varric's voice sharpened. And yes, I bound them to me. But the box is the key. If you destroy it, you don't free them. You complete my transformation. You make me fully immortal, fully powerful, and you sever their last connection to anything resembling life. They become true ghosts, mindless, formless, eternal. The shadows recoiled, their touches turning frantic. Saskia felt their horror wash over her in waves. She looked down at the box, at the intricate carvings that now seemed less like decoration and more like chains. And if I place it on the pedestal, then you bind me completely. The ritual will activate, and I will be sealed within this house, unable to leave, unable to feed, slowly starving for eternity, while the children remain as they are, conscious, aware, trapped. Varric smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Neither option frees them, Miss Vale. That's the beautiful tragedy of it all. Saskia's mind raced. There had to be another way. There was always another way. Her eyes moved from the pedestal to Varric, to the glowing symbols on the walls, to the shadows clustered around her. 7 small forms, barely visible, pressing against her like frightened animals. What if I take your place? The words left her mouth before she fully understood them, but as soon as she spoke, she felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. The shadows stilled. Varric's expression shifted from calm to something else, surprise, perhaps, or calculation. What did you say? The children need an anchor, someone bound to them by blood and magic. Saskia set the box down carefully, not on the pedestal but on the floor between them. You said you were dying when you turned them. You needed them to complete your transformation. But what if someone else took that burden? What if I became their anchor instead? Varric stared at her. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked genuinely uncertain. You're offering to become like me, to bind yourself to them, to this house, to an existence of darkness and hunger. I'm offering to free you from them, and them from you. Saskia stepped forward, leaving the box behind. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice remained steady. You want to be complete? Fully immortal? Then let me take the children. Let me become what they need. The shadows surged around her, their touches no longer cold, but almost warm, almost hopeful. She could feel their emotions shifting, changing, as if they understood what she was proposing before Varric did. You don't know what you're asking for. Varric's voice had dropped to barely a whisper. The hunger, the isolation, the slow erosion of everything human inside you. I know I can't leave them like this. Saskia met his gaze without flinching. And I know you're tired. I've seen it in your eyes, heard it in your voice. You've been trapped here as much as they have, bound by your own ritual, your own desperate attempt to survive. Let me take that burden. Let me be their mother instead of their jailer. Silence filled the room, broken only by the faint hum of the glowing symbols. Varric studied her, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he began to laugh. A low, genuine sound that held both admiration and something darker. You magnificent, foolish woman. He moved closer, until they stood barely a foot apart. You think you can bear what I've borne. You think your humanity will survive what mine couldn't. I think I'm stronger than you were. Saskia raised her chin. I think I can love them in ways you never could, and I think you know I'm right. Varric reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek. His touch was cold, but not unpleasant. The ritual requires blood, mine and yours mixed and given to them. It will hurt. It will change you in ways you can't imagine, and once it's done, there's no going back. I know. You'll be bound to this house, to them, for as long as they exist, decades, centuries, perhaps forever. I know, and you'll hunger, for blood, for warmth, for everything you're giving up. Saskia placed her hand over his, pressing his palm against her face. Then teach me, show me how to bear it, and then leave. Be free, let us both have what we need. For a long moment, Varric simply looked at her, then he smiled. A real smile, sad and beautiful and terrible, all at once. Very well, Saskia Vale. Let's make you a mother. He moved with inhuman speed, producing a small knife from somewhere in his coat. The blade gleamed in the sickly light as he drew it across his palm, dark blood welling up immediately. Then he offered her the knife, handle first. Saskia took it. The metal was cold against her skin. She pressed the blade to her own palm, feeling the sharp sting as it broke skin, the warm rush of her blood mixing with the chill of the air. She held her hand out to Varric, and he clasped it, their blood mingling. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Power surged through her, dark and ancient and hungry. She gasped, her knees buckling, but Varric caught her, holding her upright as the transformation began. The shadows swarmed around them both, their touches no longer tentative but desperate, drawing the mixed blood from their joined hands, drinking it in. Saskia felt each child as a distinct presence, their fears, their hopes, their names. Thomas, who loved stories. Elena, who sang in whispers. Marcus, who had been brave. Lily, who collected lost things. James, who remembered his mother's face. Sophie, who drew pictures in dust. And little Samuel, who had been only 4 when Varric turned him. She felt their souls connecting to hers, threads of blood and magic weaving between them, binding them together in ways that went deeper than flesh, deeper than bone. And she felt Varric's connection to them severing, those same threads unraveling, releasing him from the burden he'd carried for so long. The pain was exquisite. It felt like being unmade and remade simultaneously, every cell in her body screaming as it changed, adapted, became something other than human. She could feel her heart slowing, her breath becoming unnecessary, her senses sharpening, until she could hear the whisper of dust settling on stone, smell the age of the walls, taste the magic saturating the air. And then it was done. Varric released her hand, stepping back. The symbols on the walls had stopped glowing. The box on the floor had turned to ash, and the shadows, the children pressed close around Saskia, their touches warm now, filled with love and relief and belonging. "How do you feel?" Varric asked quietly. Saskia looked down at her hands. They appeared unchanged, but she could feel the difference in them, the strength, the coldness. When she looked up at Varric, she could see things she'd never noticed before, the faint glow of life force around him, the way the air moved in response to his presence. Hungry, she admitted, and cold, and, she paused, searching for the right word. Complete. Varric nodded. The hunger will grow. You'll need to learn to feed, to control it. I can teach you if you'll allow it. I thought you wanted to leave. I do. But I won't abandon you to this unprepared. He glanced at the children clustered around her. Besides, they deserve to see this transition done properly. They deserve to know their new mother will survive. Saskia felt tears on her cheeks, the last tears she might ever cry, she realized, as her body finished its transformation. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Varric moved toward the door which opened at his approach. You've chosen a dark path, Saskia Vale. There will be nights when you regret it. Nights when the hunger feels unbearable and the isolation crushes you, but you'll endure. I can see that now. You're stronger than I ever was. He paused in the doorway, looking back at her one final time. Take care of them, and perhaps someday find a way to truly free them. Succeed where I failed. Then he was gone, his footsteps fading into the depths of the house. Saskia stood in the binding room, surrounded by 7 small shadows who were no longer cold, no longer desperate, but simply present. Her children now. Her responsibility. Her purpose. She knelt down, opening her arms, and felt them gather close. Thomas and Elena and Marcus, and Lily and James, and Sophie and little Samuel. 7 souls bound to hers by blood and magic, and choice. Outside, through walls, she could now sense rather than see. Dawn was breaking. The first light of a new day touched the windows of Obsidian Hall, but it didn't reach the binding room. Here, in the darkness, Saskia Vale embraced her new existence, feeling the weight of immortality settle onto her shoulders like a crown. The house sighed around them, its ancient stones adjusting to this shift in power. And in that sigh, Saskia heard something she'd never heard before: contentment. As if Obsidian Hall had been waiting for this moment, for someone who would choose the shadows not out of desperation, but out of love. She closed her eyes, feeling the children's presence like warmth against her cold skin, and whispered the promise that would define her eternity. "I've got you now, all of you. And I'm never letting go."